Good evening. Welcome to another edition of the 411 Talk Zone radio show right here on YouTube. My name is Leon Jones, and tonight this is an important video you need to understand because it is the midterms coming up. So it's another political video, and this is for educational purposes only. This is called Research 101. How to read or interpret election polls. Now, there are a number of polls that I see every day. Newsweek puts their polls up. Marist puts their polls up. AP puts their polls up. Everybody's putting polls up. Everybody's putting polls up. But are they accurate or not? And I'll give you an example of how polls can be skewed. I remember when Kamala Harris got into the running for presidency against Trump in 2024. Well, after the debate that Trump and Biden had, Trump's poll numbers went up. Now, as soon as Kamala Harris came in, the polls were basically neck and neck. Some had Kamala Harris winning. Well, when you put the full picture together, how can that happen? Kamala Harris is a bumbling idiot when it comes to policies. She proclaims herself as Black when we know she's Indian. In fact, if she's Black, in her mind, she went to Howard University trying to play the role of Black, like Mamdani did. Mamdani used the fact that he had some melanin skin, I believe he cut all of his hair off where he used to be a rapper, thinking that he could cater to Black people. Well, that's what Kamala Harris did. Well, I know that Kamala Harris is Indian. Her father was Jamaican. Well, that's besides the point. What I'm getting to is how the polls were skewed. And what happened with the polls is you had some polls with likely voters, registered voters. You also had the different types of questioning. Who were they sampling the most? Well, during this video, dealing with Kamala Harris, what the polls were to do is to get people's excitement up. Now, we know Kamala Harris didn't even have any type of program. She couldn't get past the first primary in Iowa, and Tulsi Gabbard mopped the floor up with Kamala Harris. But the issue was Kamala Harris was Joe Biden's vice president. She was a terrible vice president, supposed to be the border czar. Now, you imagine if she were in power today, what would happen? See, now the real poll is when the voting is done. But you have all these polls, and a lot of polls are artificially inflated. And some, and in fact, when it comes to some of these polls out here, some of these polls didn't even move, and they were using the same polls that were a month old to become current. Well, that doesn't work. You have a lot of ignorant people out here who don't understand how polls work. So right now, I'm going to share my screen with you all. And Research 101, that's what I'm going to call it. How to read a poll. Now, first of all, what is a poll? Polls, and what do? Well, polls basically offer cold, hard data that are open to a lot of interpretation, context, including where you're getting poll results, impact polling analysis, and how to uncover different information that might not tell you the whole story. So you may have a news source that you trust to interpret the polls for you. But what if you want to look at the data yourself? Because you can't trust mainstream media. Well, reading polling results doesn't have to feel like such a mysterious process. So I'm just going to tell you this. Once you know what to look out for, polls can empower you to make more informed decisions. Now, here, I'm going to provide some guidelines for assessing and getting the most out of polling results. Now, the tips fall into three categories. First, some basics about polls in general. Second, what to keep in mind when reading a specific survey. And lastly, I'm going to discuss how to think about polls more accurately. Now, we depend for the most part on a sample, but where does that sample come from? So we get into what we call the basics. And the basics is a sample. So in polling, a sample refers to a subset of a larger population that is selected to represent the whole population's views or characteristics. So here's what happens. Pollsters use samples because it is often impractical or too expensive to survey an entire population. So instead, by surveying a carefully chosen sample, they can make reasonable inferences about opinions, behaviors, and demographics of the larger population, which that sounds true, but it is not always true. Now, if you look at the picture right here, you have the whole population and you have the sample. Now, generally, the sample sizes are, depending on what the poll is 1,000 or more likely voters or registered voters. So when we deal with sample size, fortunately, statistics helps us with determining how close the responses given by a sample are likely to be the broader population. And this is when you look at the poll that you're trying to understand. So while proper sampling techniques are critical to obtaining a representative sample, the sample size is another factor that determines how precise a poll is. So basically, a larger sample size generally leads to more accurate and reliable findings, while a smaller sample size may result in a less precise or representative result. And larger samples are particularly important when looking at subgroups and crosstabs to ensure that the number of respondents in each response category doesn't become too small to draw reasonable conclusions. Well, for the most part, I'm just going to say this, most of your polling sizes are small. And then you have what we call the Mo, not the Three Stooges, Curly, Larry, and Mo. Mo is the margin of error. So the margin of error that's reported by a pollster accounts for the variability around estimates, whether it's the candidate's level of support or the answer to a public opinion question. So basically, the margin of error represents a range within the true percentage where the polling or the population percentage is likely to fall. So again, the margin of error represents the range within which the true population percentage is likely to fall. And a smaller margin of error, there is a smaller range within which your estimates will fall if you were to sample repeatedly. So they have the Pew Research Center, McLaughlin does polls. So, but I'm going to say this. The Pew Research Center does a great job explaining the margin of error and its poll when interpreting results. So let me give you this. A margin of error plus or minus 3 percentage points at the 95% confidence level means that if we fielded the same survey 100 times, we would expect the result to be within 3 percentage points of the true population value 95 of these times. Again, it's always a plus or minus. So we could be at 92 or we could be at 98. And here's what you got here. Estimate 45%. So, or 48%. Now, how do we get that 48%? Well, you have 45 and you have 51. So with 48, remember I told you about the plus or minus 3%? Well, the margin of error is plus or minus 3. So 48 would be, we call it a mean. Now your confidence level, you're going to see that in actual statistics. And there are tables when you do actual confidence levels. They come with Z is less than. I'll get into statistics, real statistics, when I do my STEM videos. But going back to this example, we have an estimate of 48%. So plus or minus 3 is a margin of error. So if you go minus 3, you end up with 45. If you go with positive 3, you end up with 51. So this is where you get the candidates are tied within a margin of error. So that means if there is a 6-point lead between candidates, well, that 6 points falls right in the margin of error, plus 3 or minus 3. Now, basically, this is done also by sample weighting. Now, weighting is a procedure where pollsters take account of who did and who did not respond to the survey by comparing it to what they know what the population looks like. And if some types of people are underrepresented in the responses, they might give their responses a little bit more weight so that the sample can be a better representative of the full population. Or if some of the groups are overrepresented, responses from members of those groups can be weighed down as well. However, sample weighting is often used to get a representative sample of a population whose characteristics are not precisely known, such as, and I mentioned it earlier, likely voters. Here, the skill of a given pollster in generating weights can vary quite a bit, given these challenges of applying suitable demographic or behavioral weights to achieve a representative sample. For example, pollsters can use reported voting intention, voter file history, and weights like race, education level, and gender to try to achieve a representative sample of people who are likely to vote in an upcoming election. In fact, an experiment where 4 different pollsters were asked to estimate election results from the same poll resulted in a 5-point spread in estimates due to subtle differences in how pollsters tried to identify likely voters. Generally, there's an overrepresentation of a certain demographic, like women, Black people, and this is where you get all of the likely voters who are going to vote for the Democratic candidate or who are going to vote for the Republican candidate. They've never called and asked me any questions. And you also have what we call cross tabulations. So some polls provide results by demographics, which that includes age, gender, location, or other variables in the data. Analyzing cross tabs can give you a more detailed understanding of who supports what. Now, in fact, they are often extremely important for fully understanding the results of the poll. For example, where a top line might say that 51% of all registered voters support a particular candidate. A cross tab by age might tell us that only 20% of 18 to 29-year-olds support that candidate, while 75% of registered voters age 65 and up support the candidate. In this case, looking at a crosstab by age provides important insights that the top line on its own obscures. Now, if the results of a poll are represented with top lines but no cross tabs, ask yourself what the cross tabs might reveal and question why they are not being provided to the public. Now, again, a lot of these polls are done by mayors, done by media. And for the most part, they get it wrong. They got it wrong for Hillary, and they got it wrong. Really, they got it wrong in 2024. Now, this is what you need to understand when it comes to polls, particularly if you're looking at a memo or in the news. And this is how you can tell. And I might add some of my own features too. You have to, number one, when it comes to the poll and the data, who conducted the poll? Remember something, all pollsters are not created equal. So what I'm going to tell you is this. You should remember who created a poll when you read it, because pollsters' decisions like sampling techniques, weighting, and coding the results can mean big differences in what results they get. So the question, is the pollster a public government organization, a private polling firm, a newspaper? Looking at who conducted the poll may give you clues as to who the poll might be inclined to favor or oppose. However, keep in mind that who fielded a poll and their partisan bias, if they have any, is only sometimes immediately apparent because many polling firms conduct polls for other groups. Moreover, even when a pollster has no partisan bias, their polling can still be consistently inaccurate due to various quality control issues. Example, 535 maintains pollster ratings for most major US pollsters. It's again, 535 maintains pollster ratings for most major US pollsters, which are basically utilized through historical polling accuracy and adjusted for things like the type of election, sample size, and performance of other polls. Now, these ratings can be helpful when assessing polling sources' quality. Number two, you have to look at this question. When was the poll conducted? Remember, polls are snapshots in time. Always look at when a poll was fielded and consider major events that happened just before the survey was sent out that may have impacted the results. Similarly, consider what events have occurred since the poll came out of the field and how that could have shifted public opinion. For example, the Supreme Court's decision to overturn Roe versus Wade meant that early summer 2022, polling foresaw a midterm red wave that failed to appear due to the boost of urgency the ruling gave to Democratic voters. And also, too, when you were dealing with polls, are old polls being used as new polls? This is what happened during the Trump and Kamala Harris election. Now, McLaughlin, he was actually looking at polls every week. But you had some of the polling firms, they didn't look at polling data for weeks. And they were using that same polling data. And there was a little bias in that polling data. And he found out later, after the real poll took place, that their polling was inaccurate. And you also have to look at this as well. When it comes to polling, how was the poll conducted? Did the poll call voters at home or on their cell phones? Did it use online questionnaires, and it used a mixture of methods. Live caller polling had long been the gold standard, but as internet access expanded, so did the use of online polls. Now, the polling method does matter, and a given method's effect is constantly evolving. For example, in 2012, 538 found that online polls performed slightly better than telephone polling overall. However, in 2016, they discovered that Hillary Clinton's lead was larger in the live interview polls compared to the non live polls. And of course, the method only matters in so much as it affects the sample's representativeness, but even polling researchers still lack a clear understanding of the quality of online samples compared to phone based sampling. Moreover, sample quality can vary from pollster to pollster based on many factors that may or may not be related to the polling method. Number four, here's something you need to look at. Who was polled? So a general US poll typically looks at the general population, registered voters or likely voters. The group polled can have a significant impact on results, and making comparisons between polls with different target samples can be very tricky. Voters are generally older, whiter, and thus more Republican, and about 40% of Americans are not registered to vote. That's an example. Now, thus, the decision to poll a specific group can skew the results due to restrictions or lack of restrictions on a sample. Again, I'm going to use this example again. The voters can be older, whiter, they can be black, they can be female, they can be Democrat, or they can be Republican, but 40% of Americans are not registered to vote. Thus, the decision to poll a specific group can skew the results due to restrictions or lack of restrictions on a sample. Here's one thing that is important. What questions were asked and how were they framed? So don't just look at the results when reading a poll. Look at how the questions were asked. In 2022, PublicWise conducted a poll experiment where respondents were asked about their thoughts on President Joe Biden's decision to nominate a Black woman to the Supreme Court. The survey found, among other things, that how you phrase a question and the context you do or do not provide can have an enormous impact on responses. Well, depends on also how smart your audience is or how emotional your audience is. I know with black people tend to be, when it comes to politics, they want somebody to represent them. Black people vote for symbology. That's why they don't have anything. So they're going to vote on anybody who's melanin, even if the last name is Gutierrez or Muhammad, because black people want to include everybody with melanin. And that is the fact. A lot of black people are not knowledgeable when it comes to polling data. They vote by emotion. And some polls are even not quite genuine polls at all. Polling experts refer to what we call push polls to describe polling attempts designed to influence rather than measure the attitudes and beliefs of respondents. Again, you have something out there, it's a tool out there called push polls. And this is where experts use them to describe polling attempts, and they're designed to influence rather than measure the attitudes and beliefs of respondents. And what happens with push polls, loaded questions are asked, and in these loaded questions, they contain negative information about an opposing candidate or issue. So, what I'm telling you is this: always look at how a question is asked when interpreting results. This can also be a key to understanding why different polls may find quite different results for what seems to be the same topic. So you have to look at it. What is the poll trying to estimate? Well, polls are used for many tasks, such as estimating public opinion on a given issue, predicting election outcomes, or trying to understand whether a specific action or event had an effect on people's views or behaviors. So, just looking at the whole picture, these different uses require distinct levels of precision when it comes to practical applications. So, a margin of error in a public opinion poll can be larger without changing the overall conclusions in a meaningful way. Let me give you an example. A 5% difference in each direction on a question about gun control likely doesn't change the general conclusion that a large share of the population favors more gun control. But when trying to estimate the outcome of a tight political race where a candidate might win by a few percentage points, it is more important to have a much tighter margin of error. So, we mentioned the word aggregate earlier. So, how to look at polling in the aggregate? Well, in any given election cycle or when you are focused on a specific issue campaign, many of us will often be flooded with polls and surveys for months on end. This advice focuses on how to think about larger trends and things that can impact the polling ecosystem at large. Now, very important. Here are some items that you need to consider when reading polls. Look at the variety of polls from a variety of sources. A sample of one is not particularly a helpful sample, both when conducting a poll when reading it. Again, you have to look at the variety of sources. So a sample of one is not a particularly helpful sample. But what you do is you sample both when conducting a poll and reading them. Looking at a large selection of polls from many different sources will give readers a better understanding of the landscape as a whole. Pollsters make different decisions when conducting a poll and interpreting results, as the New York Times demonstrated when they gave 4 pollsters the same raw data and wound up with 4 different sets of results. Outliers are tricky. Sometimes polls can produce unusual or extreme results that don't align with other polls. So it's important to be cautious of such outliers. But paying attention to whether the pollster has a reliable reputation can help decide on how much weight to give these outliers. In the opposite vein, the phenomenon known as pollster herding can also lead you astray. Pollsters are often disinclined to publish polls that deviate too much from what others are putting out for fear of being wrong. And because of this, pollsters might hold back on publishing outlier polls. But sometimes outlier polls are not outliers at all, they are accurate. That was the case in the 2014 Virginia Senate race when outlier polls decided not to publish findings in the campaign's final stretch. Conversely, in 2020, Ann Seltzer of the Iowa poll released results in the run-up to the general election that put Donald Trump ahead by 7 points in Iowa. Again, look at the 2020 poll that Ann Seltzer took of the Iowa poll. And that resulted in the run up to the general election that put Trump ahead 7 points in Iowa. But you also have to look at it, Iowa's a red state. So most people are going to vote red, and it's most likely going to destroy the poll. In fact, here's where a poll was wrong. The Democrats put out a poll that Iowa was going to go for the Democrats, or there was a senator. I don't was it Joni Ernst? One of them. It was in Iowa that Iowa was going to go blue with the Democrat, and they're doing the same thing now. Iowa is a red state, just like my state of Indiana is. It's going to most likely go red. In fact, in the Midwest, the only real red states are Illinois and Minnesota, because even Ohio has gone red. Michigan has gone for Trump twice. Wisconsin has gone for Trump twice. Pennsylvania, which is an eastern state, has also gone for Trump twice. In fact, Trump won all 7 swing states in 2024. Now, again, dealing with the Iowa situation, the results were a departure from the tighter race polls that had been predicting in Iowa, and Seltzer faced a great deal of blowback for releasing what was considered an outlier poll. When all was said and done, Seltzer was right. Trump won by 8 points in Iowa. Now, in summary, there's a long list of things to consider when reading a poll. Whether a poll is looking at public opinion in a single state or is being used as part of a larger model to predict a presidential election outcome, it is easy to lose sight of the forest through the trees. Now, these tips that I've given you will help you make the most use of the polls when it comes to any primary. And that is not just a primary on the federal elections or with the federal elections. You can also look at your local elections, because we have the primaries coming up. So well, we have the generals now coming up. Some of the states had the primaries. So you really have to look at what the poll is talking about. When was the poll taken? What questions the poll asked? Because basically, again, polls basically offer cold, hard data. They're open to a lot of interpretation, context, including where you're getting poll results, impacts polling analysis, and uncovers different information that may not tell the whole story. You may have a news source that you trust to interpret the polls for you, but you should learn to interpret polls yourself. That's why you need to look at the 411 Talk Zone radio show here. But again, what if you want to look at the data yourself? Reading polling results doesn't have to feel like it's such a mysterious process. Again, once you know what to look for, polls can empower you to make more informed decisions. Again, I did provide some guidelines for assessing and getting the most out of polling results. And remember, polling tips fall into 3 categories. First, you need to know some basics about polls in general. Second, what to keep in mind when you read a specific survey. And lastly, you need to know how to think about polls more aggregately. And, overall, what I'm here to do is provide you the information, because we have midterms coming. We have gubernatorial races coming. We're even seeing polls from 2028. A poll is only a sample. You really can't tell how many people are going to vote. But the real poll is always on election night. And once the real poll comes out, and I'm talking about the real poll, unless you have the mail-in ballots that they're counting after 12 o'clock, the Democrats want to find some way to cheat so they can keep their socialist agenda and their communist agenda coming through America. If we do polls the right way, the real poll is when you count the votes on election day. And when you get to the real poll, all of these other small polling companies, news organizations, universities won't mean anything. So what I'm saying is this: if you really want a candidate, your candidate to win, I'm just giving you information on how to interpret the polls. Because the polls can tell lies, they can fill you with emotion, they can make assumptions, they can be deceiving and deceptive. But overall, real poll happens on election day because that's where you will see the actual results, not the results that these news organizations are going to put in biased results to deceive some people from voting or to get people to change their mind on who they're going to vote for. Remember, polls only a sample, but you need to understand how the sample works. Don't believe every poll you see on TV, because you have some polls that are right, and many of them are wrong. Why? Because they were biased and they didn't update their information. And again, you want to know what the real poll results are? Be part of your right and go vote. Whether it is on a local level, a state level, or the federal level, and be part of the voting process. Because we are a republic and we choose our representatives. Now, I don't believe a number of our representatives work for us because of all the money that's coming in from big donors. But we do have a right to vote. That's where we have the power. So understand how polls are conducted. And overall, the real result comes on election day when most of us voting. Now, there's early voting as well. But this is a topic that I wanted to bring up because you're going to see a lot more polls. It's already August. We have 3 months, exactly 3 months to the midterms. And you're going to see a lot of slinging mud. You're going to see a lot of polls. Some good polls and some bad polls. But here's what you need to know in the long run. We don't know anything until the votes are counted on election day. And then you have to understand this. The media, they call the win for the candidate and they only project. That's also dangerous too. Fox did that for Joe Biden. Called it wrong. best time to really call an election is when nearly all the votes have been counted. Not when 50% of the votes have been counted. When 100% of the votes have been counted. So overall, understand this video is to help you understand how polls work. And I want to tell you something else. To be more informed, do a lot of the research yourself. You will find that there is a lot of information that people don't get because many of us think at the surface. In the long run, the more information you have, the more informed you are on what's going on. Polls can deceive people because most people are caught up emotionally. Again, you see all this polling for Trump. Well, these polls are basically emotional polls. These are individuals that don't like the president. That's why you can't believe any of these polls, especially the samples. It's because you get a thousand people sample. It's not enough to represent 180 million. I'm choosing 180 million people because the other 40% are minors who can't vote, and that's just an estimate. But overall, understand the process, how it works, and get out the vote. Because like the United Negro College Fund says, it's your future. It's your choice. Because the real results come when the votes are counted on election day. And that's my commentary for this edition of the 401 Talk Zone radio show right here on YouTube. If you like what I just presented, please comment, share, and subscribe. And if you are looking for some STEM content, then check out my second channel, the QCIS channel. That channel, I give you a daily dose of science, technology, engineering, and math. Now, here's where you can find me. 401 Talk Zone radio show. You can find me right here on YouTube, X formerly Twitter, Rumble, and of course, True Social. And for the QCIS channel, you can also find me here on YouTube, particularly on Fridays and Saturdays, and sometimes Sundays. You can also find me on X formerly Twitter, and of course, LinkedIn. And for those of us who get offended easily, and for those of us who don't get offended easily, for the ones who are jealous of what somebody else has, and for individuals who aren't jealous of what somebody has, this is a balanced approach. So what I'm going to tell you now is this: always be blessed for what you have. Don't worry about what you don't have. Always know that the sun rises in the east, sets in the west. And if it doesn't apply, let it fly. If the shoe fits, you wear it. And if you don't like the shoe, just change it. And once again, thank you for viewing and listening to this edition of the 411 Talk Zone radio show right here on YouTube. Till next time, my name is Leon Jones. I want you all to have a wonderful, gracious evening. God bless you. I'm out.